The autumn sun was fading, and with it, the silhouette of a city older than most nations. Its stones, once laid for emperors, now scarred by fire and blood. Aachen, or Aix-la-Chapelle, as the French once called, it was not a city of high military value in late 1944. It was not a fortress by design, nor was it a strategic hub like Antwerp or Cologne. It lacked natural defenses. Its industries were modest, and yet it became a place of slaughter. Why did Hitler demand a last stand here? Why did the Allies, in a war so costly already, decide to pay in blood for a city of only symbolic worth? And what did it reveal about the Nazi psyche, about American war strategy, and about the true cost of trying to liberate a continent one ruined city at a time? Aachen sits near the border with Belgium, nestled in the shadow of low-lying hills and the remnants of the Siegfried Line. For over 1,000 years, it had been crowned by emperors, from Charlemagne to Frederick Barbarossa. It had served as a spiritual heart of German identity, the symbolic core of what Hitler would dub his Thousand-Year Reich. By September of 1944, the American First Army stood at its gates. They came not with banners, but with tanks, flamethrowers, and a tired sense of inevitability. The Allies had just broken through France and Belgium, flushed with victory from Operation Cobra and the liberation of Paris. But now, with winter looming, the Allied war machine began to falter. Aachen was to be the first German city taken by force, and that meant propaganda. To the Allies, it would show that the enemy heartland was vulnerable. To Hitler, its loss would signal weakness, a wound to the myth he had so carefully crafted. And so, what should have been a tactical withdrawal became a desperate, fanatical defense. Shadows over the city. In early September, American units approached Aachen's outer defenses with surprising ease. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall, once feared as an impenetrable bulwark, was undermanned. The German Wehrmacht had bled itself white on the Eastern Front. Whole battalions were reduced to walking wounded and frightened boys of the Volkssturm, the People's Army, cobbled together from teenagers and pensioners. Still, Hitler's grip was absolute. Local Nazi officials in Aachen, sensing the coming storm, tried to evacuate. They were swiftly arrested by SS units and sent to the Eastern Front, a death sentence in all but name. Command of the city's defense fell to General Friedrich J. Keckling, leading the 81st Corps, a mix of 2 Volksgrenadier divisions and 2 standard infantry divisions. They dug into bunkers, cellars, and half-collapsed homes, waiting for the inevitable assault. The Americans, meanwhile, were bogged down in the logistical nightmare left behind by the rapid advance through France. Supplies were stretched, fuel was scarce, even ammunition had to be rationed. To make matters worse, Operation Market Garden, the ambitious, ill-fated airborne assault on the Netherlands, had just collapsed into failure. Aachen became a sideshow, a finger stretching dangerously into enemy territory, vulnerable to encirclement. But still, they came. From the forest near Stolberg, the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, pushed forward. Veteran Sergeant Harley Reynolds recalled the unease among the men. There was talk that the Germans would never give up this city, not without a fight to the last man. We were a finger sticking out in front of the U.S. line, a very dangerous position. War of cement and fire. By late September, the weather turned. Cold winds swept through the ruins of villages. Skirmishes erupted as the Americans breached the outer lines of the West Wall. Here, the fighting was intense but sporadic, German resistance thin and inconsistent. But just as it seemed Aachen might fall with minimal cost, the tide turned. On September 22nd, German reinforcements, including the 12th Infantry Division, arrived under heavy fog. They struck back hard at the American 16th Infantry Regiment near Eilendorf. The sky, once the domain of Allied air superiority, closed with clouds. Artillery pounded the fields. Supply trucks vanished in the mud. The Americans held. Barely. But the delay gave the Germans time to prepare. Hitler, furious at the possibility of losing the symbolic capital, diverted everything he could spare to the region. It wasn't just about holding the city. It was about turning it into a graveyard, one that would remind the world of German resolve. By early October, over 24,000 defenders, including SS fanatics and exhausted Eastern Front survivors, had dug into Aachen's bones. The Allies responded with thunder. Between September 27th and October 2nd, they unleashed a saturation bombardment. Planes screamed overhead. Artillery churned the soil. Buildings collapsed under the weight of explosives. Yet the Gothic stonework of Aachen, carved centuries before by builders who never imagined war like this, held firm. It became clear. To take the city, the Americans would have to fight street by street, room by room. On the 11th of October, Lieutenant General Clarence R. Hubner issued an ultimatum to the German commander, Colonel Gerhard Wilk: surrender the city or be annihilated. October 12th, 1944. At dawn, the fog of artillery lifted just enough to reveal the jagged skyline of what had once been one of Europe's most picturesque medieval cities. What followed was not a grand assault, but a slow, grinding descent into hell. The American 26th Infantry Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Darrell M. Daniel, was assigned to penetrate Aachen from the northeast. Their immediate goal: secure 3 hills dominating the northern edge of the city terrain that housed the command post of Colonel Wilk and the last line of German artillery. These hills, cloaked in factories and bombed-out homes, would prove to be crucibles of fire. To reach them, the Americans had to push through the industrial district between Raffaella and Haren. And then, the inner city. The heart of Aachen was not built for tanks. Its streets were narrow, twisted, flanked by buildings older than the idea of the modern state. Stone church, merchant homes, baroque façade, now sniper nests and Panzerfaust ambush points. Colonel Daniel, seasoned in urban fighting, gave simple orders: knock them all down. His men moved in assault platoons, each accompanied by a single M4 Sherman tank or a self-propelled gun. Artillery softened the targets with a rain of shells, over 10,000 in just a single pre-dawn bombardment. But as boots hit cobblestone, the resistance began. Machine guns opened from church spires. Molotov cocktails rained down from attic windows. German Volkssturm old men, teenage boys lunged from cellars, wielding rifles that had last seen battle in the First World War. American soldiers, entering buildings for cover, were met with bayonets in stairwells and grenades shoved through floorboards. It was not combat. It was feral survival. In one particularly brutal exchange, Colonel John T. Corley, commander of the 2nd Battalion, was faced with enemy fortifications built into hardened air raid shelters. Machine gun nests protected by several feet of reinforced concrete. Traditional rifles, even tank shells, were ineffective. So Corley improvised. He brought up an M12155 millimeter gun mortar carriage, a mobile artillery piece designed for siege fire. It had never been used in city combat before. Its open-top crew was horrified, exposed on narrow streets as the barrel was manually aligned toward enemy strongholds. Corley stood by them, gave them cover, and watched as they fired point-blank into buildings at ranges less than 100 meters. The walls of Aachen trembled. Stone shattered. Men and memories were vaporized. As the city shook, the German 246th Volksgrenadier Division responded. They counterattacked from every street, attempting to hold on to the last pockets of resistance. American squads crawled through shattered buildings, tossing grenades ahead of every step. They didn't walk, they climbed over debris and corpses. By October 13th, the 3rd Battalion had reached the base of Observatory Hill, the highest point in the city, crowned by a tower once used by astronomers. Now, it housed snipers and artillery observers. From its peak, you could still see the distant border with Belgium and the noose tightening around the city. Death in the dust. Wilk knew what was coming. Desperate, he radioed for reinforcements. And somehow, through the chaos of crumbling roads and Allied firepower, several hundred German troops and at least 6 assault guns managed to break through the lines. They poured into Aachen's north side, rallying around Wilk's headquarters at Farwick Park, once a serene botanical garden, now a battlefield. They arrived just in time. On October 14th, Colonel Corley launched his assault on the park. Tanks rolled forward. The M12 fired again. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out in the alleys and hedgerows. But just as Corley's men prepared to overrun Wilkes HQ, orders came down from General Hubner. Hold, reinforcements are stretched thin. No further advance until our eastern flank is secure. Wilk, seizing the moment, counterattacked with what was left of General Ko Chling's 81st Corps. For 24 hours, they threw everything at the American lines, mortars, rockets, and waves of desperate men. But it wasn't enough. With weather clearing, American air support returned. Fighter bombers screamed overhead. Artillery pounded retreating columns. By October 15th, the pincer closed. Aachen was surrounded. The Noose Titans, encircled, starved of ammunition, and with reinforcements cut off, Wilkes' defense was doomed. But surrender was still unthinkable. Instead, he issued a final, grim directive to his soldiers. The Führer has demanded no surrender. You will fight to the last man. Inside the city, pockets of Germans barricaded themselves into stone cathedrals, railway depots, schoolhouses, and even the Königshügel Hospital, turning every structure into a potential death trap. American tactics adapted. Flamethrowers and demolition charges became standard issue. No longer was there an attempt to spare historic architecture. Anything that resisted even a single sniper was destroyed without hesitation. One GI later recalled, "By the time we were done, there wasn't a building left with all four walls standing. We'd go into a home with a cross on the door and end up fighting a machine gun nest in the kitchen." By October 18th, Farwick Park fell. Corley's men blasted the defenders into the basement of the Quellenhof Hotel, where some still resisted with pistols and knives. Only when the Americans threatened to bring down the entire building with artillery did the Germans finally surrender. From that moment, Aachen was broken. Observatory Hill fell on the 19th. The final resistance was shattered. And yet, Colonel Wilk still held out. He retreated to a reinforced air raid shelter with a skeleton crew of SS fanatics, determined to die rather than face capture. But even fanatics have limits. As Corley's M12 artillery was once again wheeled into position, barrel raised, fuse primed, Wilk blinked. He sent out a final message, carried not by radio, but by captured American POWs. "We surrender." When the smoke finally cleared over Aachen on October 20th, 1944, the city was unrecognizable. Streets once cobbled with stone were now reduced to gravel and ash. Cathedrals stood roofless. Apartment buildings had become mausoleums. And among the twisted metal and fallen brick, the echoes of footsteps. The United States First Army had claimed victory, but the price had been staggering. Over 8,000 American casualties were sustained in the broader campaign to breach the West Wall and seize the city, nearly 4 times as many as those lost on Omaha Beach during day. On the German side, some 6,000 were killed, with 5,000 more taken prisoner. The rest simply vanished, buried beneath the rubble, or dispersed into the forests beyond. And for what? Strategically, Aachen was of limited importance. It sat along one of 4 main roads into Germany's industrial Ruhr region, but the city itself lacked major factories or depots. The Allied supply lines, still battered by logistical failure, could not capitalize on the breach. Within weeks, attention shifted southward to the dense forests of the Hürtgenwald, where yet another costly battle would claim thousands of lives in the coming winter. Some commanders questioned the value of the operation. Was it worth it, sacrificing thousands of lives for a city chosen not for its strategic value, but for what it represented? Because that's what Aachen was. Not a target, but a symbol. A city of ghosts. To Hitler, Aachen had been more than a name on a map. It was the spiritual heart of the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, which he claimed as a precursor to his own twisted vision of Aryan dominance. Charlemagne had once ruled from here. Kings had been crowned beneath its cathedrals. It was history carved in stone. When that stone cracked, when it fell into enemy hands, the spell of invincibility was broken. It was no longer about tanks or troop numbers. It was about the myth collapsing. The Nazi propaganda machine had told the German people that their enemies would never set foot on Reich soil, that any invasion of Germany would be stopped at the border, that the Führer's vision would endure for 1,000 years. But on October 21st, the Stars and Stripes flew over Aachen's ruins. And every German who saw it on leaflets, in captured photographs, or in whispered rumor knew the lie had been exposed. From that point onward, the war in the West was no longer just a liberation. It was an invasion, a turning point in morale, not momentum. And yet, for all its psychological power, the fall of Aachen failed to generate any meaningful shift on the ground. The Allies were exhausted. The supply crisis, made worse by the failure of Market Garden and overstretched lines, meant no follow-up offensive was possible. The push into the Ruhr Valley was delayed by months. Worse, winter was coming, and with it, mud, ice, and the specter of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West. For the men who fought in Aachen, there was no celebration, no parades, no medals pinned in front of cheering crowds. There was only fatigue. A survivor from the 26th Infantry Regiment later wrote, "We were told we had captured the first German city, that it was historic. But all I saw was dust, blood, and boys who would never go home." Another, more bitterly, they said Aachen was a victory. If that's victory, I don't want to see what defeat looks like. The psychological cost was immense. Urban combat had stripped away the notion of glory. It was not a clash of armies on open plains. It was crawling through broken homes, bayoneting shadows, listening for breathing beneath floorboards. It was killing civilians with the same artillery used on soldiers because the enemy no longer wore uniforms or obeyed the rules of war. And for the Germans, it revealed a horrifying truth. Even the fatherland could become a battlefield. Even old men and children could be fed into the war machine. Aachen, in that sense, was the first of many tragedies. A blueprint for the desperation still to come in Cologne, in Nuremberg, in Berlin. Reflections from the Ashes. Historians continue to debate Aachen's importance. Some argue it was a necessary message, a show of strength, to shatter the myth of Nazi invincibility and accelerate the end. Others say it was a blunder, an avoidable bloodbath, driven by propaganda needs rather than tactical necessity. But one fact remains undisputed. The Battle of Aachen was the first time American troops fought street to street inside a German city. It was a harbinger of what the war's final phase would become, not grand maneuver warfare, but block-by-block attrition. And it taught commanders on both sides a terrible lesson. Stone kills, cities bleed, and symbols, once shattered, leave nothing behind but ghosts. In the aftermath, Allied engineers surveyed the ruins. Whole districts had been leveled. Historic churches and libraries gone. Charlemagne's capital, once the heart of a medieval empire, reduced to cinders in less than 3 weeks. And yet, beneath it all, the city still pulsed. Children emerged from cellars. Civilians tried to clear debris. A woman placed a candle on the steps of what remained of a chapel, though its roof was missing. The war had taken everything, but not the will to endure. Aachen was not just rubble. It was prophecy. What began there would be repeated again and again, until the Reich itself was reduced to stone and silence. After the surrender, silence did fall heavy and hollow. But it wasn't peace. In the days following the American capture of Aachen, patrols moved carefully, rifles raised not for soldiers, but for what lingered. Booby traps, snipers left behind. Civilians who might, under threat or conviction, still fire on liberators. For the United States First Army, there was no pause, no champagne toast. Aachen was not a milestone, it was a warning. Because what lay ahead were Cologne, Nuremberg, Leipzig, and eventually Berlin cities with even deeper entrenchments and higher stakes. The military strategists studied the urban terrain with cold precision. They noted how stone absorbed artillery, how tanks became liabilities in narrow alleys, and how even a handful of determined men could hold off entire companies from a single fortified cellar. They also noticed something else: The psychological cost. Soldiers who had fought in Aachen showed signs of what today would be called combat trauma, but in 1944, it had no name. It was called exhaustion, or battle fatigue, or simply not tough enough. But commanders could see it. Men flinched at shadows. They shook uncontrollably during lulls. Some refused to enter buildings at all, preferring to be shot in the open than ambushed in a staircase. And civilians, those who remained, were shadows of themselves. They emerged from basements with blank stares, their belongings in sacks, the smell of smoke and human rot soaked into their clothes. They asked no questions. They gave no answers. In some sectors, leaflets were distributed, printed by Allied psychological operations units. Aachen is only the beginning. Germany must surrender. The sooner it ends, the more lives will be spared. But for most Germans, it was already too late to believe in mercy. Why the city was not abandoned. In the strategic calculus of war, Aachen should have been bypassed. Generals like Omar Bradley and Courtney Hodges had, early on, favored surrounding the city and starving it out. But that option vanished as political pressures mounted. There was growing expectation from Eisenhower to Roosevelt that the Allies deliver a symbolic blow to the Nazi heartland before winter. Some have since argued that Aachen was chosen as a target not by strategy, but by narrative. The first German city captured by the Allies. The first crack in the fatherland. A symbol to the world and especially to the German people that the war was unwinnable. For Adolf Hitler, this only strengthened his resolve. Historians now know, from captured German communications and post-war interviews, that Hitler had explicitly forbidden any retreat from Aachen. His delusions had hardened by this point. He believed that the will of the German people embodied in young Volkssturm fighters and SS holdouts could repel the most powerful armies on earth. They may take the rubble, but they will never take Germany, he reportedly told one staff officer in late October. This was the core of the Nazi pathology. The land mattered less than the myth. The Reich must be invincible even if that meant destroying the cities it claimed to protect. What Aachen taught the world. Long after the war ended, military theorists and historians continued to analyze the Battle of Aachen. It became a case study in urban combat, in logistics failure, in psychological warfare. It taught generals that symbolic targets often cost more than strategic ones. It taught soldiers that no building is ever truly cleared until the silence has weight. It taught survivors that victory in war does not always feel like winning. And it revealed, with clinical clarity, the depths of German resistance. Even in the autumn of 1944, with defeat looming, cities like Aachen became human shields for a regime that refused to acknowledge reality. That fanatical defense waged not by seasoned troops, but by conscripted civilians, schoolboys, and wounded veterans, showed that the war's final year would be defined not by quick victories, but by attrition, obliteration, and endurance. Some historians argue that Aachen foreshadowed the worst months of the European theater, from the Battle of the Bulge to the destruction of Dresden, and finally the fall of Berlin. A city that had stood for over a millennium through plagues, invasions, and empires was brought to its knees not by a foreign enemy, but by ideological madness. In memory, in ashes. Today, Aachen has been rebuilt. The cathedral where emperors were once crowned still stands, though its scars remain. The stone has been scrubbed, the glass restored. Children now walk to school over ground once soaked in blood. The old quarter, rebuilt in the post-war years, tries to recapture what was lost. But it cannot, because Aachen does not forget. Its archives are filled with photos of streets flattened, of tanks wedged into alleyways, of churches collapsed into themselves. Survivors gave testimony, quietly, over decades, sometimes in German, sometimes in English, but always in sorrow. One elderly woman, who was a child in 1944, once said, "We didn't understand why they fought so hard. We only knew that every day another house vanished. Sometimes it was ours." Aachen's story is not unique, but it was the first. And in war, firsts matter. First landfall. First collapse, first city of the enemy to fall to Allied hands. It was here in fire, smoke, and silence that the world first saw the final act of Hitler's Reich begin. They called it the Thousand-Year Reich, but it began to rot in a city older than Hitler could imagine, buried beneath the stones of a cathedral older than the Reich itself. Aachen's fall wasn't just military. It wasn't even primarily strategic. It was ideological. In the crumbling walls and burning towers of that city, one could see the outlines of something deeper, the death of myth. The end of what Hitler had spent more than a decade building. Not just an empire of territory, but a cult of permanence. That's what makes Aachen different. When Paris was liberated, it was liberation. When Rome fell to the Allies, it was a strategic withdrawal. But when Aachen fell, the first German city to be conquered, it marked the breaking of a psychological dam. It was proof, undeniable and raw, that the Reich was not eternal, that the very soil of Germany could be taken, that ruins were more powerful than speeches. In Nazi ideology, symbolism mattered as much as guns. The propaganda that kept the German public obedient rested on key illusions, that the Reich's borders were sacred, that the enemy would never reach their towns. That defeat was impossible because history itself was on their side. Aachen shattered all of that, not because the city was vital, but because it wasn't supposed to fall at all. Fanaticism versus futility. The true tragedy of Aachen is not just the cost, it's what it was spent on. As the battle dragged on, the German command structure devolved into madness. Hitler's direct orders coming from his fortified command post in East Prussia insisted on no surrender, no retreat, and no compromise. His generals knew better. They could see the battlefield. They knew Aachen could not be saved, but none dared defy him. General Gerhard von Schwerin, who had briefly tried to evacuate civilians and designate the city an open target, was relieved of command. His letter to the Allies was intercepted by the SS. He was arrested, humiliated, and sent to a lesser posting. His attempt at humanity had no place in the ideology of annihilation. In his place came harder men like Colonel Gerhard Wilk, who obeyed orders even when it meant feeding his own men into inevitable death, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of the twisted sense of duty that Nazi militarism demanded. And so the Germans kept fighting, even as the city fell apart around them, even when civilians fled or died, even when ammo ran dry and the tanks stopped rolling, and the only reinforcements were old men with pistols. It wasn't military strategy, it was fanaticism, a state sacrificing itself at the altar of an illusion. Lessons etched in stone. For the Allies, Aachen was a lesson in scale. It showed how a single city block could consume hundreds of men, how artillery, though powerful, could not replace infantry in close quarters, and how even exhausted, outnumbered troops, when given enough stone and belief, could drag the world into their ruin. Urban warfare had been studied, but rarely experienced at this level by American forces. The lessons of Stalingrad were still being processed. The doctrines of maneuver warfare, of rapid breakthroughs and mechanized sweeps, fell apart in places like Aachen. Here, movement was measured in meters. Tactics became brutal and direct. A GI squad entering a house would first fire a burst up the stairs, throw a grenade down the basement, and spray bullets into any closed door. It wasn't paranoia, it was procedure, because every room might hide a Panzerfaust. Every attic might hold a sniper. Every family might be armed. The concept of civilian became blurred. Propaganda had told Germans to resist at all costs. Children were handed weapons. Women were instructed in sabotage. Elderly men, war veterans from 1914, were drafted into street patrols. Some fought, some didn't. But the line between soldier and civilian grew hazy, and the Americans, in the fog of war, often stopped asking. The battle left not just scars, but questions. Questions that would echo through future conflicts. What is the cost of urban conquest? Where is the line between tactical necessity and cultural destruction? Can a city be liberated if it no longer exists? The cathedral that wouldn't die. Amid all this, one building stood out. The Aachen Cathedral. Built in the 8th century under Charlemagne, it was the crowning jewel of the city, an octagonal marvel of Carolingian architecture, topped by a copper dome and filled with centuries of imperial history. It was also a target. Allied pilots were told to avoid direct hits, if possible. Commanders on the ground, too, instructed troops to preserve the site if it did not harbor combatants. But war cares little for cathedrals. By the end of the battle, its roof was pierced. Its windows were shattered, its interior damaged by shock waves and shrapnel. But it did not fall. Some say it was luck, others, miracle. To the men who passed by it, bloodied, deafened by artillery, their boots covered in ash, it was a symbol, not of empire or religion or any political cause, but of survival. In a city where everything burned, the cathedral stood. And today, it remains one of the oldest surviving cathedrals in Europe, still functioning, still ringing its bells, still bearing the scars of 1944 in its cracked foundation stones. Aachen, in the mirror. In the decades since, Aachen has not become a monument to victory. It has become a mirror. It reflects the contradictions of modern war, the tension between military necessity and cultural preservation, the gap between battlefield heroism and political miscalculation, the line between liberation and destruction. It shows what happens when propaganda drives war, when cities are sacrificed for myths, when symbols matter more than lives. And most of all, it reminds us that no empire falls quietly. There is always one last stand. One city where belief outlives logic. One battle that consumes more than it gives back. For Hitler, that city was Aachen. For the Americans, it was a brutal introduction to the war's final phase. For the world, it was a turning point made not on maps or headlines, but in stone, ash, and silence. They fought for a ruin because they believed it was a throne, and in the end, all they inherited was dust. After Aachen, no one doubted what the rest of the war would look like. Gone were the dreams of a swift victory, of sweeping tank columns and surrendered garrisons. In Aachen's twisted streets, the Allies had glimpsed what waited beyond the Rhine, and it was not retreat. It was resistance sharpened by desperation. The Reich would not collapse like a house of cards. It would have to be dismantled, stone by stone. The Battle of Aachen became the first brick in that long, punishing road. From there, the Hürtgen forest awaited a nightmare of mud, mines, and machine guns, where fog swallowed entire platoons and artillery became the only language spoken. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final counterattack, born from the same madness that had ordered Aachen to be held at all costs. But Aachen was the first place where American soldiers fought, bled, and killed on German soil. It was no longer a foreign war. It had crossed the border. The enemy was no longer over there. He was here, in the attic, in the church, in the shadows. It changed the psychology of the war. For American troops, it marked a shift from a campaign of liberation to one of occupation and attrition. For German civilians, it shattered the illusion of safety. And for the Nazi regime, it marked the first time the phrase Heil Hitler echoed through streets already patrolled by foreign troops, an absurdity so stark it had to be buried under tighter censorship, harsher laws, and deeper denial. What could have been avoided? There is still debate among historians over whether Aachen should have been attacked at all. Some military minds, including those close to Eisenhower, suggested that bypassing the city entirely could have spared thousands of lives. Encirclement, they argued, would have isolated Aachen without the need for direct assault. Let the garrison rot. Let the myth collapse under its own weight. But such logic collided with the politics of war. The American public, weary after day and frustrated by Market Garden's failure, needed a clear victory, something that could be printed in newspapers and declared from podiums. Aachen, symbolic and geographically close, fit the narrative. It would become the first German city to fall, and in so doing, justify the blood already spilled. In a sense, Aachen was not just a battlefield, it was a stage. The tragedy? No audience ever saw the full cost. The unseen victors. There were no parades after Aachen. No general speech. No flag-waving photographs suitable for newsreels. The men who won that city, the 26th Infantry Regiment, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, the engineers who cleared mines, the artillerymen who manned the M12s, they left not with medals, but with nightmares. One GI described it simply, "I don't remember how it ended. I just remember that it never stopped. It felt like we were killing a ghost that kept coming back in another room." Another wrote home to his family in Pennsylvania, "Tell Mom I'm fine. Tell her Aachen is ours. Don't tell her what it took." The unsung cost of Aachen lives in memoirs, in hospital records, in the 1,000-yard stares of veterans who never again walked into a quiet building without flinching. These were the soldiers who taught the world how to fight in cities. And they were the ones who paid the price to learn. The city today, modern Aachen, is clean, rebuilt, and alive. Tourists visit the Palatine Chapel, marvel at the Charlemagne Museum, and walk through streets once split open by tanks. They buy postcards. They sip coffee in reconstructed courtyards. And most of them don't know. They don't see the blood in the cobblestones. They don't feel the silence beneath the steps. They don't smell the fire that once turned an entire neighborhood into cinders because one German machine gunner refused to yield a church tower. But the city remembers. In some alleys, the walls bear small plaques, names, dates. Sometimes a sentence like, "Here stood the home of the Muller family, destroyed October 1944. There are archives, carefully maintained. There are interviews recorded decades later, in trembling voices, old women who were young girls then, speaking of cellars, fire, and the endless echo of artillery. And there is the cathedral. Not whole, but standing. The copper dome has darkened. The windows have been replaced. But inside, the stone is original. It bears shrapnel scars like wrinkles. And it still hums with the weight of history. What we choose to remember. Aachen is not a household name like Normandy or Stalingrad. It doesn't appear on t-shirts or blockbuster movie posters. It's rarely the subject of documentaries or schoolbooks. But it should be, because it tells us something essential. It tells us what happens when a war of ideals becomes a war of attrition. When politics overrides pragmatism, when mythology demands sacrifice, and reality provides it, in the form of homes, flesh, and silence. It reminds us that victory is not always triumph. Sometimes, it is simply survival. One more day, one more block, one more hill. And in that, Aachen speaks not just of war, but of what war leaves behind. History remembers victories, but cities remember everything. Wilk refused. The SS would execute any man who spoke of surrender. And so began one of the bloodiest urban battles the U.S. Army would face in the entire European campaign, worse than Omaha Beach, some veterans would later say.